Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's really wonderful to see you all here. Welcome to Family Weekend and to one of our Family Weekend Forum. My name is Richard Locke. I'm a professor here in political science and international public affairs, and currently have the great pleasure to serve as provost of Brown University. It's really great to see you all here. I don't think anyone heard the fire announcement because the tape was going. We're all talking basically fire escapes there and there. So just so that we get the most basic business done. It's really wonderful to see so many people here this morning. And let me tell you a little bit about the kind of faculty forum and how we see it fitting into not just Parents Weekend, but also as a way of kind of illustrating what we do here, I think, best at Brown. What we're trying to do through these faculty fora is to provide a glimpse into our classrooms, into our laboratories, into the educational innovation that we do every single day here at Brown, and for you to be able to meet some of the exceptional faculty that we are so lucky to have here at Brown. But these faculty fora also allow us to showcase some of the university's priorities. Now, most people don't know what a provost is. I remember when I was appointed provost and I called up and told my mom, 85-year-old mom, like, hi, I'm provost. And she's like, is that like dean of admissions? And I'm like, oh, no, nothing that important. But actually, the provost is the chief academic officer. All right, I'm in charge of making sure that we are promoting academic excellence throughout all our departments, all our programs, all our schools here at Brown. And that plan that we have for how to promote academic excellence here at Brown has been laid out in a document called Building on Distinction. And what's nice about this plan, and I encourage you to look at it, you can see it either on the president or provost website, is basically focused on how do we grow this university over the next 10 years? How do we make very targeted investments in this university, not simply by sort of investing in Department A as opposed to Department B, or building C as opposed to D, but rather what are the small number of core issues, very important issues in the world, that Brown has something to say about, that we already have qualified faculty and distinctive programs, and that by making these investments in these programs, we will not only excel as a university, but we will actually contribute to solving some of the world's great challenges. This is, I think, a very innovative and exciting way of trying to imagine how we're going to grow the university. And quite honestly, it was what drew me to Brown. This is my 4th year here at Brown. I taught at another university in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 25 years. And one of the themes of the plan is creating just, peaceful, and prosperous societies. And what's interesting about this morning's forum is that 2 of the core centers that are part of this theme are going to be represented today in our discussion. We're going to be hearing from 2 incredible faculty, Tricia Rose, who is the Chancellor's Professor of Africana Study and who leads the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, and also Tony Bogues, who is the Asa Messer Professor of Humanities and Critical Theory and directs the Center for the Study of Slavery Injustice. Now, today, Professors Rose and Bogues will lead us in discussing issues of race and racism, issues that have deep historical roots and which remain persistent and pernicious obstacles to our achieving our aspirations and values as a nation. Now, at Brown, we have been deeply engaged in efforts to address legacies of structural racism and discrimination in our society and on our campus. And we have developed a comprehensive action plan, Pathways to Diversity and Inclusion, which both Professors Rose and Bogues were instrumental in helping us develop. It's, again, a plan that I think if you have a chance to look at, it's on my website. I think it actually stands out as a very, very ambitious and detailed plan on how we can correct things here on campus. Now, we have a lot of work to do here on campus. I'll be the first one to admit that. Although with this plan and with the help of our amazing faculty colleagues, we are actually making progress. Now, this is important because we cannot, as a university, be committed to promote a more just and peaceful world and do so as distant observers, as only sort of through research, but not actually actively engaging in this issue, both here on campus and in the world. And so creating a just and inclusive campus community is also key to our ambitions as a university. Our approach to advancing academic excellence and cutting-edge research depends on attracting and benefiting from individuals with a broad range of ideas, perspectives, and backgrounds. Now, we're really fortunate to have significant scholarly resources here at Brown that draw on this work, and I'm delighted to have two such talented colleagues who have contributed, really enriched the discussion here on campus and played a leadership role in this country on issues of actually reconciling with our past, but also thinking about our future and making significant change so we can be the nation that we all aspire that we can be. It's my great pleasure and honor to count both Tricia and Tony as colleagues. Please join me in welcoming first Tricia and then Tony to the podium.
You want to go up there? Thank you, Rick. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. This is such a delight. Before I let this keyboard close, I want to make, you all right there? I want to make sure that if I close this, it won't, everything's still, okay. I know it's connected to many things. This is such a pleasure. Thank you, Provost Locke, for that really warm welcome and honest sort of reflection on what we're all trying to do here at Brown, both for Brown, but as part of the really important work of making ideas matter in the world. You know, there's this sense somehow that working in university settings that we're in ivory towers. I'm not quite sure who came up with that, but all ideas shape the world. So it matters tremendously that we interrogate the ideas that we're already engaged in living with, but also create new ones that produce the kinds of outcomes that we want. So I'm really grateful for the work that we're doing and for the leadership. I want to welcome you to Brown, all the families and friends. It's great to see students' families with you. It's just really, it's one of my favorite weekends of the year. Professor Bogues and I both share lives as scholars. Well, technically, we're supposed to do research. I don't know who has time for research with all this programming and leadership, but that's another discussion. But we do share an academic department in Africana Studies, and it's been a great pleasure to work with him for, well, really now about a decade. And we came up with this plan to have a dialogue on sort of race in the past, present, and the future, with some time focused on Black Lives Matter, because we think we're both as scholars, but also as leaders of units that deal with race and ethnicity, we're well positioned to help the community think about some of these issues. Whether or not we'll all agree is another matter, but we certainly want to have a robust conversation about what's at stake. And our centers on campus are like all of our centers on campus. They are intellectual hubs that transcend disciplines. Academic disciplines can become very insular because they become experts within experts. It's sort of like when we go to the doctor and there's, you know, a doctor who does just one elbow. You know that feeling? You're like, no, if you want to do your right elbow, that's another specialist. You know, you know, we all have that tendency. And what these centers do is produce conversation across disciplines on critical issues. My center, the Study of Race and Ethnicity, isn't specifically only focused on African American, but the U.S. and the Americas, in particular on Black, Latino, Asian American, and Native American experiences with the histories of colonization, but also the contemporary and future formations of race and ethnicity in America. So we're both very interested in the question of the durability of race and racism and the tremendous legacies of transformation that have gone underway over the past multiple decades. Our mission is also to have public conversations. I think it's incredibly important to have accessible conversations. What is the point of knowing so much if nobody can talk to you? Or better yet, won't talk to you because they can't understand you. So we're hoping that that's the other thing that comes out of this. Following this conversation, just since I'm first, I'll do a little housekeeping. I'm going to speak a little bit about my own research. Professor Bogues is going to speak about his. We'll throw it open to you. And at the end of this, we have opened up both of our centers for an open house with treats, sweet and savory, literally across the street and down a few paces. We both have sandwich boards with, some have balloons and others don't, but they're all saying, come on in, look at our art exhibits, and have a good time and see what we're up to, get an annual report, and I'll be at my center, and I'm sure Professor Bogues will be at his. So although CSREA does deal, again, as I said, with multiple groups of people and intersectional issues of race and ethnicity, my own research over the past couple of years has focused on the particular way that structural racism, structural racial disparity, has maintained itself and in some cases expanded itself in an era during which most people, the vast majority of people, pledge significant allegiance to the notion of egalitarianism, to equal access, to equal opportunity. This is a particular moment in US history. Historically, 40, 50, 60 years ago, you wouldn't have a 95% response to, yes, we believe all groups of people, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, should be not only treated equal, but should have equal outcomes and opportunities. That would have not been the case. So the fact that we have both legacies of significant disparity, but new forms of extreme disparity that are emerging in this new, what some call the post-civil rights era, is a particular conundrum. And so I've been really interested in figuring out both the questions of why a little bit, sort of how it actually happens. So the project's called, How Structural Racism Works. Like, really, how does it happen, right? It happens on all these layers. But also, what can we do narratively to change people's understanding and to illuminate just how powerful these forces are? Because they've gone on under our nose. I mean, for many of you who are not active in the anti-mass incarceration movement, just as an example, you may have come into realizing how significant this has been after Michelle Alexander's book, which was a kind of watershed, very publicly accessible book that was emotionally compelling and deeply researched. But if you really think about it, most of you look, we're all about the same. We're more in the parental age group than in the going to Brown age group. This happened on our watch. This happened while we were voting in all political parties. This happened while we were voting for mayors. This happened while we were supporting law and order initiatives. This happened on our watch, and I would bet that most of that is not something we would want to own right now. So how did it happen? This is not really about individual indictment. It's about what ideas animated this movement and made really a gateway for a serious expansion of long-standing intergenerational disparity. So the project I'm working on takes 5 key areas in American society where meaningful and significant disparity exists and where a long legacy of significant discrimination has happened, to sort of look at the way they interlock. So we're looking at housing, education, policing and sentencing and the criminal justice system, wealth, and media, to examine how these systemic forces work in many ways against our belief system consensus. Just as a quick sort of tidbit of the framework in more detail, you think about the importance of the legacy of northern urban segregation, not southern Jim Crow, but northern urban segregation, redlining, government policies, housing policies that channeled lots of resources for home ownership to all white communities and were valued higher. That was greenlining, which we don't talk about. Essentially, we only talk about the redlining. But other people got better, more fruitful colors like green. And that translated into significant financial advantages over time and intergenerational wealth accumulation. But it also determined, because we pay for education with housing, why can't I speak that? I'm like, I don't even want to say it. I'm like, we pay for it illegally. We pay for it with property taxes. If you evaluate property much more highly because of race, then you have more taxes to work with. You fund better school systems. So public schools in poor communities have fewer homeowners because most of those residents were unable to secure loans. And if they were, they would get them at increasingly, much higher rates. So you have an educational inequality that's operating based on housing. And then, of course, you have intergenerational wealth. Most homeowners, most family wealth is in the property of the home. Only the very top percentages have additional assets. And then, of course, if you're going to have discriminatory policing, it's much easier to do in segregated communities. If you have truly integrated communities, you can't target groups of people as easily because you'll have to pick them out, you know, with tweezers, as opposed to simply police in a different way. And the media has been incredibly important in recruiting and fomenting, and I mean the whole media, and I don't mean that it's every individual journalist, but the overall narrative has made it easy to obscure how these cases happen. Just think about Ferguson for a brief moment. It wasn't until after significant social media investment in illuminating what was going on that the mainstream media picked it up, but more importantly, it was only at that point that the deep systemic effects of fines and misdemeanors and forms of policing went along with education and housing and discrimination. All of that comes out after the fact, right, as sort of an explanation, rightfully so, for what the outrage was about. But we didn't really know before, right? We had a kind of normalized relationship to it. So I offer this brief sort of summary about what this research project I'm working on is about, as a context for thinking about the Black Lives Matter, not so much the movement, but the complexity of the resistance to it. And I think it's important to examine the nature of the resistance, because in the nature of the resistance lies an understanding about how race works in America today. So it's not so much to agree or disagree, but to do a kind of anatomy of what the debate is about, to illuminate post-civil rights era racialized thinking that looks neutral, colorblind, and inclusive. So how does racial thinking that is hierarchical, how does it look colorblind and inclusive in the post-civil rights era? I have to say that when Black Lives Matter as an idea got some traction in the public, you know, I was stunned by its simplicity, right, and how comprehensive it was. And you thought, okay, this can't be controversial. I had a civil rights era moment. I was like, this is great. This kind of feels like Martin Luther King. This is going to work. You know, everyone will realize that African American and other Black lives matter, and that this is, you know, a good thing. It's not, who could be against it? And, you know, I barely got this thought out of my head before it was clear that there was backlash. And the resistance was interesting because it had everything to do with the discomfort, I believe, with the idea that there is existing structural disparity, and that as a result, we need to pay attention to that disparity as part of our response. So there's the existence of significant discrimination and disparity, and then a call for us needing to respond in a way that addresses that disparity. Now, that seems very simple, but that same dynamic, existence and remedy, is what drove both, you know, affirmative action and any number of other remedy-based policies, and it also drove the resistance to it. So the logic of the critique of Black Lives Matter is the same logic of the critique, really, of any programs that have an effort at trying to redress the conditions of significant inequality. So that's the first piece of it. The second piece of it is the rhetorical response, all lives matter. Couldn't agree more. I would even include pets in here because I'm a super duper dog lover, so I would throw in dogs if it were my world. Sorry cat lovers, I like cats. I don't love cats, I like cats. But yes, all lives completely matter, but the question that Black Lives Matter invokes is, do all lives matter? Right? It's actually a question. By focusing on Black lives in a context in which so much significant, you know, public recorded violence against Black bodies is going on, you know, regardless of the individual cases, the sea of information is significant enough for some group of people to at least say, look, show me that they matter. It raises the question, what would provoke the all lives matter response as a seemingly colorblind, neutral, embracing framework. It's not sensible to me, really. So when I've given talks on it, I try to give, we don't have anywhere near the amount of time here, I'm about to close. When I give longer talks about it, I ask people to think about this in any number of other contexts. So say there's a protest against sexual violence against women, and, you know, I don't know, maybe it's a Take Back the Night or a, you know, some kind of walk of some kind, or an activist group, and they say women's lives matter, or rape victims' lives matter. Can you imagine saying, well, men's lives matter or all lives matter? It doesn't make any sense. You know, if you were to say police lives matter, which you could say, I think that's, you know, that if there's an attack on the police that's significant and sustained and a level of violence, you could make that argument. Does that mean then you would say all lives matter? It doesn't make any sense in response, but it makes perfect sense here because the embedded racial logic is that if we focus on race in particular, we will then be ending colorblind neutrality, rather than actually moving toward racial parity and equity. And that's the reversal of the post-civil rights era context. Just one last point about Black Lives Matter is that it isn't really about, and I'll make this as a position piece here and we'll throw it up for discussion later, it isn't really about police brutality per se or these specific instances. It's very important to tether those cases that we know well, or many of us have followed on social media over and over, to tether those cases to a broader set of policing and incarceration and post-incarceration practices. Policing, incarceration, and post-incarceration practices. And so these are tipping points. Almost every major riot since 1919 in Chicago has been because when African Americans have started protests, it has been specifically in response to the catalyst of excessive brutality as the front line of a broader system of violence and mistreatment and despair. So it's important because we like to then, you know, drill down, which is another strategy to avoid the big picture. We drill down and say, well, this cop was afraid, or this individual was actually, had stolen a cigarette or cigarillo, you know, but we didn't know it at the time. But so we get sort of focused in a way that is actually not helpful to see the big picture. And I mention this because, as I said, every single protest and riot or insurrection or whatever word you want to use is at the hands of people choosing to sort of say no, enough is enough around the front end of a broader system. So I want to end on one of my favorite quotes of all time, which is relevant to this a great deal. It's actually Cornel West's revisiting and revisioning of a Martin Luther King quote, which says that justice is what love looks like in public. And that it's impossible to talk about true brotherhood, sisterhood, a kind of, you know, community-based, spiritual, political love in public if there isn't a just condition to go along with it. Thank you very much.
I want to begin by welcoming you all, but also thanking the provost for chairing this, and also publicly thanking him for the work that he has been doing over the last, I would say, 8-10 months on this particular field, if you wish, of trying to make Brown a better place. I want to begin my remarks with a quotation from one of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, 1984 essay, which became very important in American letters and American historiography, Notes on Virginia. And he, in this particular essay, written in 82 and published in 1784, Jefferson argues that the difference between whites and the Negroes, he says, is that it strikes us as one of color, firstly, between skin, he says, and scarf skin, and between, or in scarf skin, and he says, also in blood, and the color of bile. And he says this difference is actually fixed in nature. He then goes on to further describe the African American as this. He says they lose hair, they have less hair in the face and body, they secrete less by the kidneys and more by the glands, and therefore, to a greater degree, he says, they have perspiration, which renders them, he says, more tolerable of heat, but also gives them a odor. He says their griefs are transient, he continues, and he then makes the point that comparing them by faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me, Jefferson says, that in memory they are equal to the whites, in reason they are much inferior. I want to begin there because I think that what that particular quotation represents in American letters and in American political understanding and in Americans' imagination is that black bodies are bodies of lack, that black bodies are disposable. And if you want to put it in a more philosophical way, that black bodies are about being non-beings. Anti-black racism, therefore, in my view, has a precise set of meanings. It is not vague. It is about disposability of black bodies. It is about black being lack, and that all black folks can be caught in that net, except, I would argue, some people who are exceptional blacks. That is, those of us who go to Harvard, who go to Yale, who go to Brown, etc. But that the vast majority of black people are essential in this country belong to this category of a disposable body. I would want to suggest to you that this idea of disposability is one that was historically constructed by slavery. Now, history never moves in a straight line from one stage to the next stage. History moves in really meandering ways, but one of the things about history and questions of change is that there are moments of continuity and discontinuity. So that one of the issues that we have to ask ourselves is that what are the moments of continuity, what are the elements of continuity in our history, and what are the moments of discontinuity? It is obviously true that things are not the same. And in fact, it is absolutely true that things are, in fact, do not look like what they look in the old days, so to speak. But if we think about history as a flow, as a way in which the continuities and discontinuities happen, then one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is how does the new appear? And in appearing, how does it remap itself on the old? In other words, to think about history as a kind of process in which what I like to call sedimented deposits happen. And because they are sedimented deposits, they actually carry, but they don't carry in the same way. They carry in new forms, and it is the new forms that we need to look at. So what is the new context? The new context is what Professor Rose has spoken about. It is a context of so-called post-racialism. It is a context in which the post-civil rights. It's a context in which formal Jim Crow and forced segregation has been legally abolished. It is a context in which there is formal political equality, formal juridical and procedural equality, which is at the apex is President Obama. It is actually a moment in which what? In which we can now call ourselves post-racial as a nation because there are forms of that kind of political equality and juridical equality which are supposed to be there. And then when you think of the young kids today, when you think of the people who, for example, were 10, 12, 13, 14 in their teenage years, who grew up seeing President Obama and have a certain expectation of President Obama, then you have to ask yourself, how does a Black Lives Matter movement occur? And I would want to suggest that Black Lives Matter movement occurs simply because what happens is that we have focused on forms of equality, primarily political equality, procedural equality, but we have not focused on the questions of social equality and the ways in which, in fact, the society may have to be reconstituted and way in which the society has to think about its past. We all talk about the Black Lives Matter as the occasion for it, as the police and police actions within the black community. And Tricia has reminded us of that long history. I think one of the differences in this moment is actually social media and technologies, and that how, in fact, what has been a common occurrence within the African American community now is seen by everybody and becomes viral. And it becomes viral in a context in which a significant number of black men are in jail, as we know. But recall again this notion of disposability, and then think about Black Lives Matter and how it emerges. Black Lives Matter emerges because it is a cry, it is a slogan, it is more than a slogan. It is a proclamation about that says we are not disposable. What is different about this movement? One of the things that is different about this movement is that within the civil rights movement, the leadership was what? Preachers and students, not like me or Tricia, but people, students 18, 19, 20 years old, who went from the north to the south, both white and black, but a lot of black students from historically black colleges like places like Howard and so on. What is different, I think, about this movement, one of the things that's different is its leadership. So here you have ordinary black women, Alicia Garcia, Patrice Colliers, and Opal Tomati, the ordinary black women who in fact form the Black Lives Matter movement and who are in the leadership. And the movement is not just about police harassment. This is what they say, and here I quote them. The persistence, they say, of racial inequality, the disproportionate employment opportunities for African Americans, and the unprecedented levels of mass incarceration, just to name a few, affirms the significance and the need for the Black Lives Matter movement in this crucial moment. If there was ever a time that we need to boldly declare without fear and intimidation, they say, that Black Lives Matter, it is now. I think this is important because what it is that by talking about Black Lives Matter, by proclaiming Black Lives Matter, they are not just addressing, as Tricia says, the police. They are actually trying to think about the entire gamut of the way in which black lives are lived in this United States, and then calling attention to the inequalities, to the injustices around it, and then saying we have to do something else. It is within that context, I think, that one has to think about the work of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. The center comes out, as many of you know, a particular report which was delivered to the university in 2006. And I was reminded by staff members this week that, hold on, it's 10 years. And it just flashed past me. And the center was actually formed in 2012, 3 years ago. But think a bit about what the center is. It is about slavery and it is about justice. So therefore, it is about a relationship of history to the present, but not an abstract relationship, not just an academic relationship. I would argue that the work that we have to do is one that has to be characterized by scholarly rigor. But scholarly rigor is different from detachment. There is no detachment in this kind of field, in my view. No detachment, because if you want to build a just and prosperous society, then you have to actually be passionate about it. But passionate does not mean that you don't have scholarly rigor. It really doesn't. The two things can be combined. And therefore, what I would argue is that for our work at the centers is that there is a passionate understanding of what we're doing and bring a certain passion to it, but that we do so with a certain kind of scholarly rigor. And we do it at this university in a way in which we have to actually model and show the world how it can be done. And we do it at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice because, as I said, deposits come forward. In other words, sedimented deposits, so what people like to call the legacies of slavery. The legacies of slavery are mapped and remap themselves onto the structures and the way in which structures function in American society today. The center functions by having 7 research clusters, and I will not talk about those 7. I just want to quickly highlight 3, which I think are important. 2 which we only began this year, and 1 which we began 2 years ago. The 2 we began this year are around education, and the other one is around questions of race and medicine and medical knowledge. And the one about education, we work with the Annenberg, and this to me is really important, because what we are trying to do is to think about the public school system in Providence, in the state of Providence and the plantation, Rhode Island and the plantations rather, which is what we're still called, Rhode Island and the plantations. And to think about questions of pedagogy in the school systems here. And so we have 2 excellent researchers from the Annenberg who have now joined us as faculty fellows who would lead a program for the next 3 years trying to think about this particular question. The second one that we started was around race and medicine. And this I'm really very, very happy with and spend time sitting down in that working group. I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a scientist, I'm a humanist or interpretive social scientist, whatever nomenclature people want to give me. But I sat down with the working group that was formed this week, just listening to them. And they were from the medical school primarily. And it was fascinating to hear them wrestle with some of the questions, not about health disparities, which we all know, but to try and think about how do we produce medical knowledge that is based upon a certain biological understanding of African Americans that then actually reproduces our understanding of what diagnosis we should make. And what are the problems with that? And are there difficulties with that? And so that they want to spend time very carefully trying to understand that. They're not making a judgment now, but they're saying, we think that there are set of problems. And what we want to do is to investigate those problems. And that's really important because as a university, one of the key things that we have to do is around knowledge. That's one of the things that a university is supposed to do. It's a knowledge production entity. And therefore, if you are trying to think about this question of what kind of knowledge orders you produce, what you teach students and your undergraduates and graduates, then you have to begin to think, what are the foundations of what you do and how you might want to reflect on those foundations. And the third thing, as I said, is this business of, the third project is a global curatorial project. And that's a project we have been doing for 2 years. And at the heart of that project is simply this. All evidence shows us that people get their historical knowledge, not from the books that we scholars write, but they actually get their historical knowledge from museums. Ordinary people, thousands and hundreds of people that walk into these places. So one of the questions that animated us in the center was, okay, how is slavery and questions of race represented in the museums? And how can we tackle that question? And what we did was that we put together museums from all over the world, 6, 7 museums from all over the world. From France, we developed a relationship with the Smithsonian National African American Museum of History and Culture. From South Africa, where there was slavery, the Ezekiel Museum. From Senegal, the Art Museum of Africa. From the Netherlands, the Dutch were very big in the slave trade, but you would never believe it if you go to read any Dutch history book or any history course in Dutch University or go to their museums. And so we put together, and after 2 years, really tried to come up with a set of things as to how, in fact, our set of ideas as to what are the best curatorial practices that we can actually develop that will represent what some of us call the impossible. So how do we represent that? And secondly, how do we represent the system as not now something that's just peculiar to the Caribbean, where I'm from originally, or from the United States, where I've lived for many years now, but how can we see this as a world system that actually shapes the world and the modernity as we actually know it? And that program, I think, has really been very successful. The Estonian have now finally agreed they would lead the exhibitionary practices or the exhibitions that we're going to have. And the Dutch have actually, I just got a note last week that they have actually finally agreed and that the minister is about to sign off on a program about trying to get how to think about slavery in Dutch museums. And then the French, whom we had thought we were going to have difficulty with, just wrote a letter last week saying, we agree with you guys, can you help us decolonize our museums? All right? And that, I would say to you, when that was brought to my attention by by my staff, by my assistant director, she would tell you I had to sit down and say, I don't believe this one. All right? Let me read that again. All right? So that we are in a position of working from the slavery and justice to actually trying to develop to intervene in America, but to intervene in the world. Because we live in a global world. We all talk about globalization, but we actually, if you want it to mean something, I think we have to think through how do we actually intervene. One more thing about the center which you might want to know is that we are a research center, and we have these projects as I've spoken about, but we also do something which I call public humanities. And for us, what is important is what I call public history. How do we do a public history so that ordinary people and people all over the United States can begin to grapple with this question of slavery and its meaning? And one of the things that we are actually doing is in the state of Rhode Island is that we're doing a marker where all the ships came. And we are doing that with the various historical societies from around the actual state. So to think about the question about Black Lives Matter is to think about how is it that you can do research, scholarly work, how can you do what some people call engaged scholarship, but how can you develop a set of practices that will, with rigor and with scholarly, and with a certain kind of scholarly understanding, but with a certain kind of passion that actually challenges the structures of the world that we live in. And so therefore, for us at the CSSJ, what is important is to understand that the past is the past, but is also to understand, very frankly, how that past continues to have echoes in our present, and therefore what are our scholarly responsibilities as human beings to tackle those echoes. Thanks very much.
So we have at least 10, 15 minutes for questions, comments, dialogue. I think there are 2 microphones in the aisles, which I think we would love you to go stand at if you have a question, because otherwise we won't have a copy of what happened for posterity. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Bridget Pierce from the University of Michigan and a parent.
Sorry.
Can you speak up a little bit?
My name is Bridget Pierce. I'm from the University of Michigan, and I'm a parent here.
Oh, great.
And my question has to do with cultural appropriation. I struggle with it because to me over time there's a cultural dialectic that happens, and yet I fear that I'm doing the wrong thing by incorporating something into, do I dab? Is that the wrong thing? You know what I mean? To put kind of a humorous spin on it, but your thoughts. Or anybody's thoughts, really.
Well, I'll start us off. So, the phrase cultural appropriation refers specifically to an exchange of culture on unequal terms, on terms of inequality, unequal representation, unequal value, unequal resources, and the use of that sort of the appropriated culture for the purposes of either disregard, entertainment, disposability, to go back to Professor Bogues' description. It doesn't mean cultural exchange, cultural sharing, hybridity, or change, which is what all culture is going to do. It refers specifically to the hierarchy of the nature of that exchange. So we can all be in the business of cultural exchange in our classrooms, in our families, if we do the requisite homework to go along with it, to really put that creative expression or that idea or that slang in context. And the moment we do that meaningful contextualization, now we come to the practice, to the style, to the dance, to the slang, to the music, with a deeper appreciation of both its artistry and the struggle, which is really what disempowered communities have to deal with, is creation under conditions of duress. Then we can see the struggle and the beauty of that. And so now we're in the business of exchanging human beings, people to people, not just more consumption of other people's creativity. So that's the big difference, and that's why appropriation is something many students are upset about on campuses, is because the media embrace of so much different culture has created the feeling that there's a kind of tourism, a decontextualized tourism that goes on, and young people are frustrated about that because they understand that the power, the hierarchy is being maintained in that situation. So exchange is not the problem. Appropriation is a specific unequal exchange. Yeah. Oh.
Good morning. My name is Jim Dodenhoff. First, thank you so much for your talk. Really appreciate it. I'm visiting from Los Angeles. I have a daughter who goes to school here, and I graduated
Great.
from here a long time ago. My question is I'm going to try and ask it in the right way, and I hope it's within scope. We're coming to the end of the 8th year of President Obama's presidency, and this term you use, post-racial, I think is a really interesting and good term. And I'm curious, have scholars, or other people for that matter, is where we are at today in this country sort of a predictable outcome of Obama's presidency? And I'm really not even talking about policy.
Right.
I'm just talking about the fact we have our first African-American president. From my perspective, I wouldn't have predicted that we would have been here, and here, of course, is perceptive. But I'm really curious about that. Is this sort of a natural part of the arc of where we have to go?
Yeah.
So I hope that makes some sort of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you come back to this idea of continuities and discontinuities, so that if there were no discontinuities, if the Jim Crow and segregation was still the order of the day, juridically and custom, then you would not have had a President Obama. What is interesting is that the emergence of President Obama's presidency then, in fact, gave a life, in my view, to the deposits that have continued in the society. And that what they were able to do was, in fact, to come out of the closet in different organizations, which I won't talk about here, and simultaneously to attempt to construct a public discourse in a so-called post-racial moment that was coded with race. I mean, it was a really very complex but a really good maneuver if you were just trying to think about
Strategy,
it objectively. It was a way in which you now have an African-American president, so now you have political equality, now everything is okay, but we can still talk about racism, we can still do anti-black racism, but what we have to do is to find different codes in different ways to do it. And I think that's what you've seen in the political field. What is troubling certainly for me as a scholar is that, but what is also troubling, quite frankly, is that more and more as I read and try to come to grips with genetics, because I think all of us have to, right? It becomes very clear to me that there's a way in which all biological notions of inferiority are being mapped and remapped and appearing in the major journals by different people, not by, by different professors from Arizona, from elsewhere, from various other places, publishing, the New England Journal of Medicine or, and so on, or in Science, publishing articles that actually reproduce this idea of a certain kind of biological difference. But that difference really comes out of a certain classificatory schema, which really has its birth in the 1700s and natural history. And in that natural history, the so-called African was at the bottom of the totem pole. And that to me is also, becomes very worrying, because what you are then talking about is that we have not paid sufficient attention to this question of the way in which knowledge operates and how different forms of knowledge actually organize themselves to continue in ways that are fairly old ways, even though the science may be fantastic. and technologically, advanced. So that's how I see it. One is, I don't think many of us expected the kind of backlash, right? But I think that if you were thinking, right, then we'd have seen, yes, it would actually come. I think a lot of us were, certainly I know, I was caught up in this symbolic, I have difficulties with him and so on, but I was caught up in the symbology of him and Michelle and the kids. That's the truth. But then, but lots of people saw that symbology and also decided what they were going to do. And I think there's one more thing I would say on that it also demonstrated to me, certainly, and Tricia knows this better than I do, that there is a way in which race works at the level of the visual and at the level of ideas that we don't pay sufficient attention to. Because it catalyzed and it worked at the level of what we like to call the symbolic.
Yeah.
Right? And how that symbolic works.
Yeah. Just one sentence, and then we'll take the next two questions together. I will say that I was really worried about it when Obama was elected. I actually wrote a piece that I didn't actually publish, where I said that he would be a racial albatross, that we would actually be, because of the nature of how he was elected, as an illusory post-racial black president. As soon as you get a black president, they have to be post-racial. I found that kind of ironic. I thought, it was the context for that I thought then would render impossible the critiques that needed to come and would stifle the kind of challenges that if he were a white president and did the same thing, African American and other allies would have come up with. So that was one of my worries. After a while, I did enjoy the symbolism, but I did worry a lot about that, just to clarify. So why don't we take both of these questions simultaneously.
Well, thank you for your talk, and I also want to thank you for the presence of both of these centers on campus. I graduated from Brown, and my daughter's a freshman, so I love that you're here. The question that I wanted to ask is what role is Black Twitter and the social media revolution really playing in reshaping the social justice movement?
Great, thank you.
And then I just also wanted to say thank you to Brown for putting this on, because I firmly believe that with this, there are no bystanders anymore. This is a call to action that we need to go ahead and deal with this head on. But the thing that I had wanted to get your thoughts on a little bit more in terms of the disparity possibly being driven by confusion and fear is what is the actual socioeconomic piece in terms of first and second class citizens going through and driving some of this fear, and then also with the movement of where it's going to take us into the future. Whether there's even talks of various socialism and things of this nature, and what it could even do on a political scheme with democracy.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll take the Twitter question. That's what you get for letting me go first, Tony. No, I'm happy. I'm happy to do a little bit. I'll do a little bit of both. So this will be fair. So Twitter has been transformational in very interesting ways, both for good and for bad. In that it's an unfiltered, unregulated space. If you speak to many people who have gotten to be visible on Twitter and who have been attacked, you will know that it's not, a civil playground. So you have to think about the question of regulation of public space as being not always repression, but also, necessary constraint for the kind of full expression. But Black Twitter has been very powerful around really creating an alternative critique of certain kinds of colorblind but ultimately racially problematic ideas that are perpetuated in mainstream social spaces, whether they're political areas or mediated spaces or educational ones. And that's been very productive. As I mentioned, again, the particular case of Ferguson, which hasn't, isn't the only one, but there are many examples like that where both a critique and an alternative politically comes out of it. The Say Her Name campaign around gendering the conversation about police violence in important ways. But even the, my favorite sort of very powerful one was after, I don't remember which shooting it was after, because I've keep a little distance so I can survive, basically. But one of them provoked, I think it might have been Mike Brown, where, the question was, is he a thug, and therefore, I guess, ipso facto, you should shoot him. But a hashtag called "If They Gunned Me Down" emerged, where young people put up a picture of themselves partying, with either alcohol or doing peace signs or, looking tough, and then the picture of themselves also graduating college, taking care of little kids, doing public service, going to the military, and they put them back to back saying, if they gun me down, which picture are you going to see? And it was just unbelievable. Hundreds and hundreds of people doing it, saying, this is the framing of the who we are that shapes and fuels practices that are so destructive. And you couldn't do it any other way. Everyone had to do it from their perch to say, both of these images represent me. Which one will you see? So to me, there's tremendous potential, tremendous potential.
Yeah, let me just say very quickly, in response to the second question, the W.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction in the first chapter and the epigraph says that how this chapter is going to be about how black people came to America, and that was at once a challenge to its democracy. And I think that that is a really very important statement. And it's written in 1935. But it is really important because what I think he was arguing is that there's a way in which the questions of slavery and racial domination complicate how we think about democracy, and has to complicate how we think about democracy. And therefore that we can't think about democracy in the normal way of just representations and political parties. That we have to begin to find ways of association. This is what democracy is about, forms of common association. We have to begin to think about forms of association that will allow us to fully explore and confront this history and this present situation that we have that is a consequence of the actual history. In the actual text, he says we need to have abolition democracy. Not quite sure about that in 2016, but what I do know is that what Black Lives and what other people are trying to think about is, okay, what are the forms of democracy that we now need?
Yeah.
What are that's just not just going to vote, and voting is critical. Trust me, I watch all the 3 debates. I follow this thing closely, and voting is going to be very important on November 8th. All right, absolutely. But it is the beginning, not the end. And so that what it is that we need to do, and how can we come together as a community to begin to really explore and take further the American experiment, which began in the 1700s. That's a question that I think is on the table. Yeah. And that's a question that I think one would want to think through. I don't think that, I think, because, I watched Bernie Sanders very carefully, and I was happy to see him and so on and so forth, quite frankly. But I also have to ask myself that in the 21st century, are there new issues and new questions that have to do with technology, that have to do with how we think about ourselves and on the planet, of environment? I mean, all sorts of other questions, ecology. Are those new questions that we now need to find a set of answers to? Plus some of the old ones that have been there from the 1700s.
Right, yeah.
So that's my response to you.
Well, I think we're out of time. I think you might have other fora to attend. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.